Chapter 3 of Esther introduces us to the final main character in this story, namely Haman, and it reveals the plot to destroy all of the Jews, which is formed by Haman. Verses 1 through 6 of Esther chapter 3 say this. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all of the princes who were with him. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Now, again, the words "after these events" discloses the passage of time. Haman was promoted sometime between the 7th year of Xerxes' reign, when Esther became the queen, and the 12th year of his reign, as indicated in chapter 3, verse 7, which refers to the 12th year of King Ahasuerus. Now, Haman is named or described as an Agagite. Most of the commentators conclude that Haman was a descendant of the Amalekite king Agag, the enemy of Israel during King Saul's reign. So, if that's true, then of course we have two of the main characters, Haman, a descendant of the Amalekite king Agag, and Mordecai of the tribe of Benjamin, who was, of course, that was the tribe that King Saul was from. And so if that is the case, the author may be indicating that the ancient hatred between the Amalekites and the Jews had been inherited by Haman. Josephus does explicitly say that Haman was an Amalekite and was naturally an enemy of the Jews because Israel had destroyed the Amalekites. Now, the fact that the king in verse 2 commanded his servants to bow down to Haman suggests that they were reluctant to do that on their own. So we don't know exactly why. Haman may have just been a not a good character, not the kind of person you want to bow down to. The reason why Mordecai refused to bow or pay homage to Haman also is unclear. Mordecai had told the king's servants that his refusal related in some way to the fact that he was a Jew. But the act of bowing or prostrating oneself before a superior in and of itself was not against any Old Testament law. And there are a number of examples of God's people prostrating themselves before kings and others. We see that in Genesis 23, 27, 1 Samuel 24, 2 Samuel 14, 18, and 1 Kings 1. Now, it may be that Mordecai's pride led him to refuse to pay homage to a member of the ancient enemy of the Jews, the Amalekites, whom God had devoted to destruction. On the other hand, it is idolatry to worship any other human being. And Josephus indicates that bowing to Haman was, in fact, a form of worship, and that's why Mordecai refused. Again, I mentioned earlier that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which was completed by 132 BC, also indicates that Mordecai refused to bow because it represented idolatry. Now, the fact that Haman was filled with rage as a result of Mordecai's not bowing tells us something very important about Haman. Pride, specifically sinful pride, essentially is concentrating on oneself. It's being self-absorbed. Now, there are different kinds of pride. One type of pride is where the person feels superior to others and tends to be arrogant and look down on everybody else. On the other hand, there is a form of pride based upon feelings of inferiority. The person feels he or she is never good enough, is always beating himself up, but that person is just as self-absorbed as the person who's thinking about himself as superior. We don't know which one Haman was. Maybe there was something about him. He felt inferior. The king had to order people to bow to him, and he needed that affirmation, and that's why he got so angry with Mordecai for not bowing to him. C.S. Lewis makes this, I think, important comment. He says, "As long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things or people, either others or himself. And, of course, as long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. Namely, you can't see God because you're focused on yourself, you're looking down on others, or you're looking down on yourself." Now, of course, there is another form of pride. That is a national, racial, or tribal type of sinful pride. And again, that may be asserted, you're asserting that my tribe, my race, my country is better than everyone else's. But yet that can be caused by feelings of inferiority. And this kind of sinful pride can result in tremendous evil and genocide. Witness, of course, the genocide by the Hutus against the Tutsis in Rwanda in 1994, and the Nazis' attitude toward the Jews in the 1930s and 1940s, resulting in the so-called Holocaust. Now sinful pride is the opposite of humility. A truly humble person is not thinking, "Oh, I'm so humble." He's not thinking about humility at all. The idea that God wants is for us to stop focusing on ourselves and look to Him and look to others. As Lewis points out, that a truly humble person could design the best cathedral in the world and know it to be the best and rejoice in that fact without being any more or less or otherwise glad as having done it himself than he would be if it had been done by somebody else. You see, because a truly humble person is not focusing on yourself. Yes, you can rejoice in your accomplishments, and that's not sinful pride, okay? You can be proud of your country. You can be proud of your son, your daughter, your father, and so on. That's not sin. But the truly humble person is not focused on himself or herself. And so that is why, of course, Jesus said that the entire Bible is summarized in two commands. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's not focusing on yourself. And that's why the Bible says in James 4, verse 6, God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble, because pride is fundamentally an anti-God attitude. And that was exhibited by Haman to a very large degree, which leads us then to chapter 3, verses 7 through 11, which say this. And this talks about Haman's plot to kill the Jews. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, that is, the lot, was cast before Haman from day to day and from month to month, until the 12th month, That is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all other people, and they do not observe the king's laws. So it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry out the king's business to put into the king's treasuries." Then the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said to Haman, "The silver is yours, and the people also, to do with them as you please." Now, casting lot, and by the way, that's, as we'll see, that is why the festival of Purim is called Purim, because it's based on the word pur, P-U-R, which is the name for the lots that were cast. Casting of lots was a common method in the ancient world to determine the will of the gods, or, in Israel's case, the will of God. We see that in a number of places in the Old Testament. Now, Haman used a mixture of truth and untruth in his giving his plan to the king. It's true, as he said in verse 8, that the Jews are different from, the laws of the Jews are different from all other peoples. But it is untrue when he claimed to the king, they do not observe the king's laws, because they did. Notice something important. Haman does not name the Jews by name, and he does not name Mordecai, which was the source, or who was the source of his rage. He also appeals to the financial interest of the king. The king had spent a lot of money in the invasion of Greece, and so Haman says, "I will pay 10,000 talents if we wipe out this people that doesn't even obey your laws anyway." And so the signet ring is the official seal, and it shows the king's approval of Haman's plan. Interestingly, again, look at the king. Back when Vashti refused to come into the king's presence back in chapter 1, the king never asked, "Why is this?" He didn't ask, "What's your reasoning?" Here, Haman has a plot to destroy people all across the kingdom, mass murder, and yet the king doesn't even ask, "Who are these people?" He asks nothing. He just gives Haman the right to do whatever he wants to do. So then, chapter 3, verses 12 through 15, talk about the edict that Haman composed. And those verses say this: "Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and it was written just as Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, and to the palaces, or to the princes, rather, of each people, each province according to its script, each people according to its language, being written in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. A copy of the edict, to be issued as law in every province, was published to all the people, so that they should be ready for this day. The couriers went out impelled by the king's command, while the decree was issued at the citadel of Susa. And while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was in confusion. Now, by giving Haman the signet ring, the king permitted Haman to word the edict any way he wanted to, and he made the decree as clear and comprehensive as possible. It went to every province in the kingdom. It was written in all of the languages of the kingdom. It specified the date when mass murder was to take place. It specified who the victims were to be, and all the Jews, and he emphasized that by saying young and old, women and children. And it gave the people a financial incentive to kill the Jews, namely that they could then seize their possessions as plunder. And piling up all the Jews, young and old, women and children, and the verbs destroy, kill, and annihilate demonstrates the thoroughness of this edict. But verse 15 ends by saying the city of Susa was in confusion. This indicates that the people of Susa did not necessarily share Haman's virulent anti-Semitism. Which leads us to chapter 4, because in chapter 4, Mordecai learns of this edict to kill all the Jews. He informs Esther that she must petition the king to revoke this, and he warns her that your position as queen and as the king's wife will not enable you to escape the fate of all the other Jews. Then chapter 4, verse 14 is probably the key verse in the entire book. It says, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this." So, in verses 1 through 3, Mordecai learns of Haman's plot and laments. Those verses say, "When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. He went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. In each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes." Now, tearing one's clothes and putting on sackcloth and ashes were traditional signs of humbling oneself, of repentance, of mourning, of lamentation, and of grief. So Mordecai and all the rest of the Jews did this along, with public weeping and wailing to show the seriousness of this situation. And he apparently went to the king's gate so that Esther would know that he was there and that something was amiss. We then read in chapter 4, verses 4 through 9. "Then Esther's maidens and her eunuchs came and told her, and the queen writhed in great anguish. And she sent garments to clothe Mordecai, that he might remove his sackcloth from him, but he did not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach from the king's eunuchs, whom the king had appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. So Hathach went out to Mordecai to the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict, which had been issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show Esther and inform her, and to order her to go into the king to implore his favor, to plead with him for her people. Hathach came back and related Mordecai's words to Esther. Now, although Esther was queen, she had not seen the king for 30 days, as we will learn in verse 11. And she evidently was unaware of the edict to kill all the Jews. Now, Mordecai's not removing his sackcloth when Esther sent him proper clothing indicated that something was seriously wrong, and that's why Esther sent Hathach, the eunuch, to find out what the problem was. Well, we learn what happens next in the final half of chapter 4, verses 10 through 17, which say this. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. And they related, so that's what Esther told Hathach to go tell Mordecai. And so they related Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arrive for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this?" Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way. And thus I will go in to the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him. Now, Mordecai, of course, could have dressed in proper clothing and attempted to go to the king himself to intercede on behalf of the Jews. But he naturally wanted Esther to intercede because she's the queen, and she was the king's wife. And because of her position, she would likely have much more influence than had Mordecai done this on his own. But again, Esther informs Mordecai of what the situation is. "I'm taking my life in my hands because the king has not summoned me." But verses 13 and 14 critically point out that her life was at risk. Yes, was at risk if she went to the king without being summoned. But her life was at risk even if she did not go see the king. And in fact, Mordecai was pointing out, if you don't see the king, you will die. Relief is going to come through some other means, but don't think you will escape. You and your family will be killed. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I think verse 14 is the key verse in the entire book. And it helps to put Esther's life in proper perspective. Even though God is not mentioned in verse 14, it's revealing the complete helplessness of the Jews. And that when it says, deliverance of the Jews will arise from another place, can ultimately refer only to God. In other words, if Esther does not act, God will use someone else to save the Jews, but Esther and her family will perish. And again, so you see, God is not even named here, but it's showing his providence is at work. Now, the principles enunciated by Mordecai in verse 14 apply to all of us. God is sovereign and active in the affairs of people. The Bible indicates God is ultimately the one in charge of life and death. He stirs up people's spirits. He puts thoughts in people's minds. He turns their hearts. Typically, God acts through his creatures, not immediately and directly. Everything God is doing, either directly or more typically through his created order and through his people, God is at work. And that's why the Bible gives a dual explanation of events. And in our book on biblical theology, this is called the doctrine of concurrence, God acting with his creatures. And I've got about 80 instances in the Bible where one and the same act is attributed on the one hand to God, and in another verse, or in a latter part of the same verse, is attributed to secondary agents, people primarily. So one writer has used this analogy to describe this dual action of God and people. Think of stereoscopic vision. It's the fact that we have two eyes that see the same thing from slightly different angles that reveals the dimension, the depth that you can't get if you only have one eye. And so that's, God is at work and people are at work at the same time. And again, God is at work in us, as it says in Philippians 2, verse 13. We are to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So Esther then agrees to go to see God after this fast, this 3-day fast. And you think of Esther's calling for the fast is reminiscent of the people of Nineveh and their king calling for a fast when Jonah proclaimed that Nineveh would be destroyed. Now, fasting is typically, of course, accompanied by prayer to God. As I mentioned, in the Hebrew of the book of Esther, it doesn't mention prayer at all. But the Septuagint, as I mentioned, does include additions that are not in the Hebrew version of Esther, and they're in after chapter 4, verse 17, which is the last verse in chapter 4. The Septuagint includes prayers of both Mordecai and Esther. So, in any event, we see, again, a commonality from the book of Jonah when a whole people, Nineveh, was prophesied that they were going to be destroyed in 40 days. All the people and the king called for a fast. And that is what Esther does when she learns that her people have been slated for destruction. So that is the big problem. And so now Esther knows about it. As we go on, we will see what she does about this.